Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Robinson, and I'm with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And I'd like to welcome you to the Vision 21 Linking Systems of Care for Children and Youth webinar on implementation science done in partnership with the Office for Victims of Crime. Before we begin, I'll provide you with a brief overview of how our webinar system works and how you can interact with today's presenter. Below the PowerPoint, you will see a list of materials related to today's, we don't have materials related to today's presentation, please forgive me. Visual feedback is a way you can quickly interact with the presenters of today's webinar. At the top of the screen, you'll see a button resembling a person holding up their hand. To the right of that is an arrow. By clicking the arrow, you can see a list of options for providing visual feedback. You can ask the presenter to speak louder or slower, or indicate that you agree or disagree. To the right of the file box, you'll see a chat box. In this window, you'll be able to send messages to the other participants on the webinar. But please be aware that chat entered into the Everyone tab will be recorded and posted as part of the recording for this webinar. To chat, simply type your message in the white field at the bottom of the window and press Enter on your keyboard, or click the button to the right to send. Our staff here at the Council will be monitoring the chat box for questions, so if you have a question for our presenter today, please enter it into the chat pod and our presenter will answer your questions as time permits. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar or you have a question about one of our interactive features, please send a private chat to us here at the Council and we'll help you address those issues. Thank you for your attention while I explain the features of our webinar system. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Lyman Letgers with Casey Family Programs to introduce himself and begin our webinar. Lyman?
Thank you, Michelle. Before we get
started, okay, thank you for being so patient.
And Casey Family Programs is the largest operating foundation in the nation solely devoted to serving the needs of children in foster care. I have been with Casey for 13 years, and I'm currently actually on a very interesting assignment as a senior fellow. I'm on loan to the Department of Justice, where I work primarily in the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, but also have the opportunity to work with other offices throughout the Office of Justice programs, including the Office of Victims of Crime. And I'm really excited about this project, Linking Systems of Care, and having the opportunity to share with you some thoughts about implementation science. I am a student of implementation science. I'm not an expert by any means, but I have had lots of experience implementing programs and actually came across this notion of implementation science about 6 or 7 years ago doing work in the state of Ohio as we were helping the state roll out alternative response across their child welfare systems. And we brought in the National Implementation Research Network to help kind of frame the initial implementation work and strategies. And I was just enthralled by the work they had done and was reflecting on my experience in implementing programs and systems initiatives, and had wished I had more knowledge of implementation science 15 or 20 years ago. I think you will find that this notion of implementation science aligns well with this project. You'll certainly see how it can, or I hope that you will see how it connects with the 4 broad categories of the final report of Vision 21. I think that the way this project is designed in terms of the Phase 1 and Phase 2 allow for the kind of time that is advocated for within the field of implementation science. And I think that also you will be able to see how this implementation science will be able to inform and support the 3 objectives in Phase 1 of the project. So let's dive in. Next slide, please. So what we'll talk about and what I'll share today are some thoughts around, first of all, what is implementation science? Secondly, I will share with you the frameworks that have been developed by the National Implementation Research Network, excuse me, and try to talk a little bit about how they can help inform your work as you roll this project out. And finally, I'll share some questions, I think, that will, I hope, spark thought and dialogue on your part about how these frameworks and how implementation science can be incorporated into the work that you're doing around developing strategies and approaches to launching this initiative. Next slide, please. So implementation really is fills the gap between what we know in terms of science and best practice and getting it actually to the customers, to the clients that we serve, getting that science, the programs that are developed, the systems reform efforts that are developed, and implementation really helps us then move that to service. So the National Implementation Science Network defines implementation as the process of incorporating effective strategies into typical human service settings to benefit children and families. And let me say that this science was essentially developed following the wave of development of evidence-based programs in the 90s, because we were developing all these great programs, but what was missing was how to effectively integrate these new evidence-based programs into systems, into large programs. And so this kind of evolved out of that, and it's defined, implementation is really defined by a specific set of activities. It's a process as opposed to an accomplished fact, something that we have actually accomplished. So implementation is not a static thing. It's very dynamic, and it is a process. Next slide, please. So again, if the implementation fills the research to practice gap, it takes what we know works. And let me just ask, I'm sorry, is this slide show a quote at the bottom, children and families cannot benefit from interventions?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So implementation fills the research to practice gap. It takes what we know works, and it defines or helps us determine how we get it to our customers and to our clients, ultimately improving practice, improving policies, improving systems, and improving the outcomes related to those we're trying to serve. So Allison Metz, this quote is attributed to Allison Metz, Dr. Allison Metz, who's the co-director at the National Implementation Research Network. Essentially, children and families cannot benefit from interventions they do not experience. Next slide, please. Implementation is not a passive process. It's not simply diffusing or sharing information. It goes beyond lift and drop methods, kind of off-the-shelf programs that we want to kind of bring into our systems or our organizations and just share with people and see if we can get new things going. It's beyond sharing written policies or practice changes. It really takes us beyond this notion of the typical ways that we have tended to implement programs and systems. And I know that people are at different places with this notion of implementation, but in my experience, most systems, most large organizations still use standard ways of what we call of starting new programs and then calling it implementation. So sharing a new policy or enacting a new piece of legislation or presenting some training around a new practice or a new policy and really calling that implementation without formally developing an implementation strategy and giving the strategic time necessarily to fully get there. Next slide, please. So business as usual, as I just mentioned, we see diffusion and dissemination of information, training, laws, mandates, regulations, new funding, grant programs, incentives, and actually organizational change or restructuring within organizations as typical methods to implement change or implement new things, new processes within our system. Now, all of these things are important, but by themselves, they simply do not yield the kind of results that we want to see. They're necessary, but not sufficient. Training, for instance, has been described as the spray and pray method. So we spray everybody with some training and pray that it works. So again, all of these things are important. We need to think about them. We need to include them in our strategies. but in and of themselves, they yield a very low return on investment when we're trying to get new things started within our organizations and systems. Next slide, please. The science to service gap. We know that that we have to implement programs. There has to be fidelity to the models in order to get good outcomes. The programs have to be sustained for a long enough period of time. We have to have strategic patience when we're implementing programs. It's very difficult to get overnight results from new programs, so we have to have strategic patience and make sure they're sustained. And we have to also make sure that the programs or initiatives are taken to a large enough scale to have the kind of impact that we want to see. So this is where we struggle a little bit with pilot programs and yielding small returns and not taking the kinds of programs that we think are effective to scale in regions or jurisdictions. So making sure that we are including fidelity, including the correct length of time and sustaining the programs long enough, and making sure that we're impacting the broad enough cohort of customers, clients in the program, in the new program or initiative. Next slide, please. So there are essentially two frameworks articulated by the National Implementation Research Network. The first one is the stages of implementation. They initially started with 4 stages of implementation and later added two stages at the end, and I'll go through each one of those in detail in just a minute. The second framework is really the core components or drivers of implementation, effective implementation, that need to exist within the organization, within the system that is supporting or advocating the implementation strategies. So the next slide, please. The 6 stages of implementation are described as exploration, installation, initial implementation, full implementation, innovation, and sustainability. I'm going to talk about each one of these in a little bit more detail. Typically, the installation phase is what most people think of as implementation. And what the science shows is that we don't really get to full implementation of a new initiative until 2, 3, 4 years down the road of actually starting the program. One of the beauties of this project, of the Vision 21 project, is that it's actually written into this that you all are starting with this notion of an exploration phase, that planning phase. And so as I describe the exploration phase, I think that you'll see how that fits with the way this project is structured. Next slide, please. So what happens during the exploration phase or stage? This is where you talk about what it is you want to do. What is the problem you're trying to solve? What are the options available to you to solve that problem? How will they fit into your existing structures and organizations? What structural and functional changes need to happen within your organization? This is the opportunity to really kind of engage with people throughout the organization or system, whether it's system leaders, direct practice folks, community folks, young people, families, to really bring them in at the front end and get that buy-in for the innovation and also their supports for implementation, because often we'll need a broad array of folks to really support and advocate for the strategic patience to make sure the implementation is effective. This is also where decision makers will make recommendations about whether or not to pursue a particular initiative to move forward with a strategy. And most importantly, this is where it's recommended to develop, convene an implementation team. And the implementation team, there's some writing about that on the National Implementation Research Network website that I'll share at the end of the presentation. But I think the implementation team needs to have a broad array of folks on it, folks who know the practice, know the populations, the clients, people who can make decisions, people who have access to resources and can make calls about budget resources, about other kinds of resources and supports from the organization or system that's doing the implementation. Next slide, please. So the second stage of implementation is what's called installation. This is where you're going to make the formal changes. This is still before the program, the new initiative starts. So this is where you want to make sure that all of the structural and functional changes within the organization are made. This is very important to have a process if you're hiring new staff or bringing new staff or shifting staff responsibilities, to understand as much as possible what protocols can be established for that. And I know we work in public systems, so often we have to work within the constraints of working with public employee unions and bargaining units. And so just bringing them also into the negotiation around the staff competencies you want to identify if you're bringing on new staff or shifting staff roles. And then selecting, if there are new practitioners coming on board, selecting them, or whoever the people are that are doing this new work, making sure they're selected and brought on board. If there is training to be done, this is where the initial training would happen. And I tend to recommend that you train not only the people who are doing the new work and delivering the new service or new intervention, but also train those who are around them so that they understand the new thing that's happening within the system, within the organization. Develop a coaching system. I cannot overstate the importance of this. There's a slide that I'll show that will come up a little bit later that shows the value of coaching over simply training and supervising. So just making sure that you think about if there is an opportunity to have a coaching system or mechanism in place for the folks doing the new work. And then establishing or evaluating the data systems. What are you measuring? Do you have the systems in place to measure, to ensure fidelity of the new practice, to make sure that you're tracking the outcomes that you desire and making sure those things are in place. Next slide, please. So the next stage, or third stage, is what is called initial implementation. And this stage really is where you're just starting the new work. And all of us who have implemented new programs know that there's definitely some awkwardness, some struggles at the front end, making sure people know what's going on, may run into some resistance around new work that's happening. And just the initial implementation stage is really designed to help work through that. Make sure that new skills are continually supported and developed and nurtured. Make sure that there's attention to additional supports that may be needed to really push new thinking and doing within the organization. Any of us who have implemented new programs or done systems change know that it can be scary. It can be frightening for those working in the system. So be reassuring and make sure that there's time to talk it out and support the folks that are doing the work. Training and coaching, making sure that's part of it. On the practice, the systems change. If there's a reorganization, making sure that everybody can see themselves in their new roles and within the goals and the vision of the organization, and just making sure that there's training and over-communicating clarity around functions and structures. It's also advocated to make use of improvement cycles. So if anybody's familiar with the Breakthrough Series methodology, the notion of implementing Plan, Do, Study, Act cycles is something that is encouraged as well. And I'll talk a little bit about that because that's one of the later stages. But in this process, small tests of change, if that's feasible or reasonable within the work that you're doing, make a lot of sense. Make sure that you're learning from mistakes and definitely celebrating small wins at the front end, highlighting the new work, making sure that you're supporting and celebrating the participants, and continuously, again, over-communicate clarity about the new work, encourage folks to buy in to it across the organization, across the community. Next slide, please. Full implementation. This is where the school skills and activities in the system are really becoming standard. They're becoming the new way of doing business. The skills are honed. The activities are normalized within the system, within the organization. Everything's integrated. If it's a new program or new unit, it's really part of the organization. It's fully functioning. The practices by staff and supervisors and administrators are meeting performance criteria and are at a high level of effectiveness and skill development. Changes in policy are incorporated, and we see the policies reflecting new practices and new interventions, and you're really ready now to be evaluated, to measure what's going on and to measure it against the outcomes that were desired at the front end. Next slide, please. The fifth stage is around innovation, and this is where I mentioned the improvement cycles, plan, do, study, act, methodologies, thinking about spread. So if you're starting small and wanting to expand through a region or a jurisdiction, this is where you think about spread and how you want to replicate effective operations or programs, and ultimately taking it to scale. So again, scale and spread are two very different things. Spread is replication and can be replicated in different parts of a jurisdiction or even different jurisdictions completely. If a program is effective, it might be started. If a program is effective in one county, it might be started in another county in that state. But spread really is taking it to a regional level. So if the initiative is effective in a given county, we want to make sure that everybody in that county is receiving that service, or everybody who's eligible is receiving that service. If it becomes effective in multiple counties, we want to see it go statewide, and that's really the notion of taking the effective practice to scale. And finally, next slide please, the sixth stage is really sustaining the work that has become institutionalized, it's become part of the organization, but it really is having the impact and having the effect that you want to see. So making sure that as leaders of the systems, and organizations are attending to the organizational culture, the organizational health, and that the interventions are continuing to be supported within the organization. Understanding the notion of purveyors. Who are those who are delivering the new intervention, the new system? Are there, and really making sure that they are providing the very best service and marketing their services, marketing that intervention effectively. Continuing, even though it's now probably 4 or 5 years down the road, make sure that the implementation teams stay in place. That's really advocated for. Even though they may change, the membership may change, you really want to have a team overseeing the intervention, the program, so that there's still a place to make changes and make shifts. And then the last thing on there is this notion of motivators, and understanding that in these kinds of reform or systems change efforts, the things that motivate people that do this work are not typically the way systems and organizations operate. Organizations tend to look at structural motivators, performance reviews, performance standards, merit increases, employee of the month, staff celebrations. Those are structural motivators. And when I'm talking about motivators here, I'm talking about the motivators that drive people into the work that we're taught, that we're all about, the work of really changing the lives of vulnerable children and families. And those motivators are more intrinsic. So those paying attention to how to engage staff in this work, what drives them to do this work, why do they do this, and how does the work that they're doing really connect with their kind of life goals, life vision, and then how does that all connect back to the goals, and the mission and vision of the organization. So let me actually pause there and see if you all have received any questions that I could respond to right now.
It looks like we don't have any questions right now.
Okay. Okay. Well, let's go to the next slide. This slide is really a graphic or a depiction of what the science says implementation, the time it takes to really move to full implementation. You can see it's based on the 4 initial phases or stages of implementation: exploration, installation, initial implementation, and full implementation. And it is, that's just a graphic to really help folks articulate the need to give the kind of attention to implementation that's needed to be effective. So the next, okay, sorry, you're getting some feedback as I was trying to get reconnected to the conference. Okay, my apologies. Sorry for the technical difficulties. The next slide talks about drivers. What are the effective drivers of implementation? And they're broken into 3 categories. Competency drivers, those qualities in staff and the people doing the work that we want to see, how they're supported, how we select staff or people doing the work. The second category around organizational drivers, is the organization tooled to host and embrace the change and the new services, the effective or the new intervention that's being implemented. And lastly, leadership drivers. So making sure that leadership is engaged, understand the strategies for effective change management, and really is poised to make decisions and provide guidance and support the functioning organization with the new intervention. The next slide, please. This next slide gives you a visual of the implementation drivers. So you can see on the left side of the triangle is the competency drivers. So looking at making sure that there's criteria for staff selection or selection of whoever's, maybe it's an organization that's going to do some work or provide some technical assistance or something like that. Whatever the selection criteria are, making sure that you're paying attention to that. What training is necessary for the people, for the new intervention, new program. And then establishing a coaching structure that supports the staff that are doing the new work. On the right side are the organizational drivers, making sure that there's the data system that supports effective decision making, making sure that there's administration that is behind the staff, the folks doing the new piece of work. Do they have the kind of administrative supports that they need? And are the systems aligned? And I did see in the initial plan that it looks like the notion that this is a multi-systems effort, I think is really important. And even the first objective in the phase 1 is to bring in a network of stakeholders. And I think that is the systems intervention that the implementation science would advocate for. Excuse me. The leadership drivers are essentially making sure that leaders are poised to help with the technical decisions, the day-to-day decisions that are necessary to make this work, to make this intervention happen, but also understand adaptive leadership and that this is about fundamentally changing the way we do business. So for the population of victims that this initiative is trying to impact, we're really trying to create the adaptive change that fundamentally changes the way the system or the jurisdiction responds to victims of crime, youthful victims of crime. And these are not linear like the stages of implementation. These are really integrated, and they support each other. So this is a graphic. Again, you can we'll talk a little bit more about them, but you can get a lot more information about these drivers and go much more in depth through the resources at the National Implementation Research Network. Next slide, please. And I just said this, the drivers are interactive processes, they're integrated, they influence staff and organizational behavior, making sure that staff feel supported, feel like they're part of the organization, the structure, that the work is really incorporated in the organization and is part of the way we do business now. So the next slide please, really talks about this notion of training and coaching. And it's a nice graphic. I think it's important because it helps us see the impact of incorporating coaching into our strategies for implementing new programs, new skills, new structures. So you can see on the left column it talks about training components. So having conversations about theory and philosophy, demonstrating, actually doing demonstrations through training, allowing for practice and feedback during the training, and the last, the bottom line is around adding to all of those things coaching in a classroom. So starting with theory and discussion, adding demonstration and training, adding practice and feedback, and then ultimately adding coaching. If you do any of the above, the top three components, the maximum or the yield that you'll see for use in the classroom is less than 5%. When you add the coaching to it, you see a 95% ability to demonstrate knowledge and use the new skills in the classroom. So this is something that was compelling to me, because I think it just shows the value that if we add a coaching component, the likelihood that our staff who are doing the new intervention, doing the new practice, will not only be able to demonstrate it in the classroom, but will be able to use it with our customers and clients. It just elevates it, and it shows that that's a huge return on investment simply by adding the function of coaching in our work. So that's the end of the presentation around the implementation stages and implementation drivers. I do have a set of questions that I will share with you that I think will help you think through next steps with the Vision 21 project. And they simply are, next slide please. This is what are the implications for the Vision 21 demonstration sites? What are the implications as you're thinking about launching this in your jurisdictions? What are the implications of understanding the strategic patience it takes, the stages of implementation, the implementation drivers, the coaching and training concepts that were presented, and how does that help inform the decisions and kind of rollout that you're involved with over the next 15 months? How do these concepts inform the development of, inform the steering committee and the TA providers and the OVC grant and program staff, the Office of Victims of Crime grant and program staff? How do these concepts are important for folks who are influencing the direction of this initiative, from the steering committee to the National Council to staff here at OVC? And can we see how implementation science applies at both the program and systems level? It's a lot of the work that the National Implementation Research Network has engaged in recent years has been around systems change. It was originally designed or originally developed to support implementation of specific programs. But more recently, it's really looked at how we use these concepts to really impact systems change in many venues. So those are the questions that I would leave you with, and Hopefully we will be able to talk further about those as things proceed with this project. And the final slide just has a list, well, two resources. One is the NERN website. Their work is all open source, so you can access resources on their website. The second one is actually a presentation around the stages of implementation and an article in a PDF that I think is helpful. And then the last bullet is my email address, and I'm always happy to answer questions or be a resource to anybody who's interested in working with vulnerable children. So I want to applaud you all for taking on this initiative. It looks fabulous to me. I'm excited to see how it plays out, and I'm happy to be a resource in any way that I can. So let me stop there, and either we're going to have a few questions, or I'm going to give you the gift of time this afternoon and end before our 4 o'clock stop time. So I will pause again and see if there are any questions that I can respond to.
So we'll take a few moments here to allow people to type their questions into the chat box. Thank you. So some people have stated that the second link does not work. We will make sure that we send the good links to folks who are on the webinar. We'll make sure that you get those via email.
Okay, I'll check on that too and make sure that I typed it correctly.
Thank you. So Bethany has typed that there were some new terms and concepts introduced that were at least new to her, which on one hand was a bit overwhelming, but on the other hand exciting, in that she thinks we use some different terminology, and she's typing some more, so let's be patient.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. This is based on the work of the National Implementation Research Network, and there are other organizations that have done implementation work and systems as well. So language may be different, but I suspect that the concepts and the flow of it are very similar. It is a little overwhelming, isn't it? A lot of information to fit into a webinar.
So Bethany states that, yeah, that even though there's some different terminology, we're still talking about the same stuff, and that Vision 21 Linking Systems of Care is on a similar track, and that it's important to acknowledge for all of us that this takes time and patience and commitment and perseverance. Lisa has typed a question that says, what parts of the initial implementation framework do you find the hardest for community organizations to grasp?
The initial implementation frame?
Yeah, what parts of the initial implementation framework do you find the hardest for community organizations to grasp? In my experience, it has been really building the buy-in across the organization when we start, and it partly depends upon the size of the organization. So when we start something new, when we bring a new idea or a new concept in, there is this notion that the folks working on it are somehow special,
And there's the tendency to, and I don't think it's intentional, but there is a tendency to ostracize new programs and new staff. And if it's a dramatic change, the implications are that what we've been doing previously is not effective or is wrong, and so there's some tension around a new thing being successful, right? So I think it's really engagement. I think the engagement of staff, engagement of the organization across the board, whether they're directly working in this or not, is really important. And again, over communicating clarity about why this is important, why this initiative is about the vision of our organization, why it's better for children and families who we all care about. So I would say it's really, getting that buy-in and engaging folks across the organization is where attention really needs to be paid. And it's not something that we are typically trained to do. I mean, if it makes sense to us, we feel like it should make sense to other folks and just have to kind of share it. But I think this is a place where it has to continually be communicated, until it really becomes the way we do business.
Lori has a question. She says you mentioned and encourage coaching. Would that
Yes.
be at the agency program-specific supervisory level?
I think that it's most effective at the supervisory level, so making sure that supervisors are the ones providing the coaching, and I mean they're also going to be held accountable for outcomes if they are supervising the programs or the units implementing the new practice. So I think helping supervisors become those coaches is really important. We found that effective at Casey Family Programs in our own direct practice work around permanency outcomes for young people. So making sure that supervisors were knowledgeable around effective practices and were able to help them coach the social workers that were working directly with the children and families. So yes, I think working with the supervisors is most effective.
Amanda has a question. She says, how do we get community agencies to see the value in thinking about and investing in implementation and not just the program they're implementing?
Sorry, how do we get communities?
Community agencies to see the value in thinking about investing in implementation and not just the program that they're implementing?
Well, that's a really good question. Well, first I think for community agencies, I would share with them the science, the knowledge around what we know is effective in terms of implementation. If they are if they are part of the new initiative, bringing them in at the front end and talking about it from that perspective, also gaining their own experience and insights into how things have been rolled out within their programs. I would say that most community agencies that I'm familiar with that are getting funding from governments are not given the kind of strategic planning time that are built into this Vision 21 project. So I would actually suggest that using this model is what is I don't know if gift is the right word, but it's really innovative, and it allows for the time necessary, presumably the resources, the front end resources, to have the community agencies be able to partner and effectively staff up, ramp up their organizations through this implementation process. So I hope that was helpful. I actually haven't pondered that question. That's a really good question, and I think it's something that we probably should look deeper at if we're engaging community agencies with our systems to roll this out. So it would be a great conversation to have.
Thank you. Bethany has made a comment, which I think is a great comment. It says it's a marathon, not a sprint. And she also wonders if we can have touch-base webinars or consultations with you, Lyman, along the way as the program develops for the sites as well as for OVC and for us here at the council, and that maybe it would help us bite off chunks and digest, implement as appropriate and timely along the way.
Absolutely happy to provide any support, especially if Bethany's the one asking for it. But yes, most definitely, I'm happy to help. I'm excited about the project. I think it's got a lot of value, and we're really, as its title says, we'll have an opportunity to really transform the way we look at victims and really respond differently to them. So yes, definitely, I will be a resource as much as I can.
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left. If there are any other questions, I encourage you to get those in. Lisa is typing, so we'll wait for her question. So Lisa's question is, when do you begin discussion about sustainability?
I would say at day one, and I think the discussion about this, so in thinking about sustainability and actually presenting on sustainability from a philanthropic perspective, I think that the best sustainability plan is a good implementation plan. So you're actually, by having a strong implementation strategy and plan in place, you're actually starting your sustainability work at the front end. I also think the sustainability is defined by the kind of asking the so what, the so that what question. We're doing this so that what, and continuing to ask that question. What is it? What is the goal? What is the vision of this? We're trying to impact young people who are victims of crime or victims of violence. And so if that then would drive, what we mean by sustainability. So it's not sustaining a program just to sustain a program. It's sustaining a program in order to achieve a goal and achieve a different outcome, realize a preferred future for victims of crime. And so I think that is the discussion. And so sustainability starts really day one. So let me just reframe that a little bit. So conceptually, sustainability starts at day one. I think that when you start thinking about resources to sustain the program, to sustain the project, that really does start within the exploration phase. What is needed for this kind of long-term project? We're talking about a 5-year project. Having those discussions at the exploration phase, so that's going to help you think about how you select staff, what structural changes need to happen within the organization. Are you going to work with a community agency or nonprofit to be the purveyor of the service or deliver the services? How do you engage with the people who are making decisions about budgets and policies? Are political folks involved, and how do you think about this, kind of beyond 2-year budget cycles and 4-year election terms? So I think that conversation really happens as early as possible.
Thank you. Carlene has a question. She says there are many resources listed on the NIRN website. Do you have any suggestions on must-read articles or reports?
Well, I'm trying to get the link up for the article that I listed on the page so I can send you an active link. So that's the one I would start with. I'd have to go in. Let me see if I can go in and send out something via email, because I'm not looking at the website right now, so I don't have any off the top of my head, but I can certainly send a couple of articles that I've used and shared with jurisdictions in the past and send that out via email, if that'd be okay.
That'd be great, and then we can forward that on to participants. Lisa says, do you have any handy words in describing implementation to trainers who are very committed to their training and building competence, but are less interested in and committed to implementation principles?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
Sure. Do you have any handy words in describing implementation to trainers who are very committed to their training and building competence, but are less interested or committed to implementation principles?
I don't, but I'd love to engage in that discussion. I think that, again, training is an integral part to effective implementation, but it's only part of it. And so it can't be seen as the answer. It's simply a piece of the answer. But I think that, again, gaining knowledge around what we know about the science related to implementation would be helpful for trainers who are focused on skill development and training of staff. But it can't be I think that it does have to be a discussion. It has, engaging them to share how important it is for training to be part of it, but to really show that training has to go along with other things. It has to go along with these organizational supports. It has to go along with this notion of coaching. And I guess also speaking from experience and having people share experience about how training has been effective or not, and at what levels training has been effective for the kind of change that we're trying to implement. So that was off the top of my head. You got me started, but I think that that's a really good discussion to have at some point as we're in this exploration phase.
Lisa says that she appreciates your response. Are there any other questions or comments? Bethany says that we should definitely keep these conversations moving forward, keep the conversations going, moving forward in the project.
Excellent.
Nikki Camp says, thank you so much for this information. It's very helpful to have an idea of what this will look like and to have a realistic view of what's coming.
Well, thank you.
I have one more comment coming.
Okay.
Lori says this would be a great topic to explore further when we have an in-person grantee meeting. Definitely worthy of more discussion. Thank you for your feedback, Lori. That's a great idea. And she says, thanks for the information. So we have 2 more minutes. So this is the time for any final comments or questions for Lyman. While we're waiting on those questions or comments, I do want to remind folks on the call right now that on July 9th, ICF will be presenting a webinar on site evaluation. So look for that save the date information. It will be coming soon. And again, we ask that you invite all of your partners and city members.
So Michelle, if I could make just one final comment.
Absolutely. Please go right ahead.
So it's certainly been a pleasure to speak to you all. I want you all to know that this is really a very broad overview and introduction to this. We were able, within the National Forum on Youth Violence Prevention, to work with the National Implementation Research Network to come and do an in-depth training with representatives from the sites of the forum. And that was actually a 2-day immersion in this notion of implementation science. So going in-depth into these concepts and these principles, but also having the sites do work related to their jurisdictions during that 2 days. So I just wanted to give that as kind of a framework, and if that's something that would be of interest, we can try to help facilitate something like that as well. And I apologize for the technical difficulties. I don't know what happened, but I hope it worked for everybody.
Well, thank you very much, Lyman. That brings us to the end of our webinar. We'll be reaching out to you all via email to send out those links to the information that Lyman provided. Thanks for your time and attention. Everybody have a great day.
Bye, everybody.